Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that'll make your worst job complaints seem like a vacation. Picture this: you're a medieval doctor, and every single patient you touch could literally be your death sentence. You wake up each morning knowing there's a decent chance you won't see sunset, and that's just Tuesday. She mixed the mercury potion at dawn and was dead by noon. The twist? She wasn't the patient, she was the doctor. In medieval times, being a physician was basically signing your own death warrant, and I'm about to show you exactly why these so-called healers had shorter lifespans than the people they were supposed to cure. Here's something that'll blow your mind. A 14th century study found that doctors died at twice the rate of executioners. Think about that for a second. The guy whose job it was to literally kill people had better survival odds than someone trying to save lives. But wait, it gets worse. Medieval physicians weren't just dying from disease exposure. They were being murdered by grieving families, poisoned by their own medicines, and burned alive as witches when their treatments inevitably failed. By the end of tonight's journey, you'll understand why some doctors actually fake their own deaths to escape the profession, and why the most successful medieval physician on record quit medicine to become a pig farmer, and lived 20 years longer because of it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and what time you're listening. I love seeing where this story travels around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the muddy streets of 14th century London, your leather physician's bag heavy with instruments that feel more like torture devices than healing tools. The weight isn't just physical, it's the crushing knowledge that every house call could be your last. You've seen colleagues disappear overnight, some found floating in the Thames with mysterious puncture wounds, others simply vanishing after treating the wrong nobleman's suspicious fever. The irony hits you like a plague-infected rat. You became a doctor to save lives, but now you're constantly calculating which patients might actually kill you first. That merchant with the swollen neck? His brother already sharpened his knife and promised to use it if the swelling doesn't go down by morning. The baker's daughter with the strange rash? The whole family has been muttering about devil's marks, and you know exactly how those accusations end, with you screaming as the flames consume your flesh. You pause at the next door, hand trembling as you knock. Inside, someone is dying, and they're counting on you to work a miracle with your pathetic knowledge of bloodletting, toxic herbal concoctions, and desperate prayers to saints who seem to have abandoned the medical profession entirely. But here's the terrifying truth that keeps you awake at night. You're probably more likely to kill them than cure them, and their family will hold you personally responsible either way. Medieval medicine was a deadly game of Russian roulette, except every chamber was loaded with a different way to die. You're not just fighting disease, you're battling ignorance, superstition, and a society that expects you to perform miracles while simultaneously suspecting you of practicing dark magic. The medical schools taught you to read urine like tea leaves and balance the four humors, but they never prepared you for the psychological warfare of treating patients who might murder you if you fail. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians were brave healers or desperate gamblers addicted to the thrill of cheating death daily. But one thing is certain: they lived in constant terror of their own profession. The Hippocratic Oath said, "First, do no harm." But in medieval times, harm seemed to follow doctors like a starving wolf, threatening not just their patients, but their own survival with every diagnosis they dared to make. You check your bag one more time, feeling the cold metal of your bloodletting knife and the small vials of mercury-based medicines that could cure or kill with equal efficiency. Tonight, you'll discover exactly why medieval doctors feared their jobs more than the plague itself, and why the smartest ones often chose death over continuing to practice medicine. You lift the razor-sharp lancet to the nobleman's swollen arm, and immediately you feel that familiar knot of dread tightening in your stomach. This isn't just another bloodletting session. This is a potential death sentence with your name written all over it. The patient's skin is already pale as parchment, his pulse weak and thready, but his family stands behind you like vultures, demanding you drain the bad blood that's making him sick. Here's the thing about medieval bloodletting that'll make your skin crawl. Doctors had absolutely no idea how much blood was safe to remove. They operated on the brilliant theory that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids, so naturally, the solution was to drain people like wine barrels until they either got better or died trying. The problem? Most patients died trying, and guess who got blamed for turning a sick person into a corpse? You make the incision, watching crimson liquid flow into the brass bowl below. 1 cup, 2 cups, 3. The patient's breathing becomes more labored with each passing minute. His wife grips your shoulder with claws that could rival a hawk's, whispering threats about what happens to physicians who kill their husbands. You want to stop, every instinct screaming that you're watching a man bleed to death. But medieval medical wisdom demands you continue until the patient either recovers or expires. The most terrifying part isn't the blood, it's the mathematics of medieval medicine. Physicians were expected to remove anywhere from 1 to 4 pints of blood per session, sometimes multiple times per week. To put that in perspective, losing just 2 pints can send a healthy adult into shock. And 4 pints? That's often fatal. Yet here you are, following the teachings of ancient Greek physicians who probably killed more patients than they saved, all while the patient's family watches your every move like judges at an execution. You remember your colleague Marcus, who bled a merchant's son last month. The boy was suffering from a simple fever, nothing that rest and fluids couldn't cure, but the family demanded the full bloodletting treatment. Marcus drained 3 pints from the kid's arm, and by evening, the boy was dead. The merchant didn't just demand compensation. He hired thugs to break Marcus's hands so he could never hold a lancet again. That's medieval malpractice law for you. No courts, no appeals, just swift and brutal justice delivered by grieving relatives. The bowl fills with another cup of blood, and you notice the patient's eyes starting to roll back. His pulse is barely detectable now, a butterfly's whisper against your fingertips. You know you should stop, but stopping means admitting failure, and failure in medieval medicine often meant a very unpleasant conversation with the local authorities. Or worse, an impromptu meeting with an angry mob carrying torches and rope. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians genuinely believed bloodletting worked, or if they were just too terrified to admit the entire practice was homicidal quackery. The medical texts of the time praised bloodletting as a cure-all for everything from headaches to heartbreak, but the mortality rates tell a different story. Patients who received aggressive bloodletting died at rates that would make modern emergency rooms look like health spas. You finally make the decision to stop the bleeding, pressing a cloth against the wound while praying to every saint you can remember. The patient's breathing is shallow but steady. he might actually survive this particular medical intervention. But as you pack up your instruments, you catch the family exchanging meaningful glances. They're already calculating whether their patriarch's condition improves or worsens, and your future depends entirely on which way that medical coin lands. The walk home feels longer tonight, your bag heavier with the weight of another near disaster. You pass the house where Dr. William used to live before that unfortunate bloodletting incident with the mayor's daughter. The building stands empty now, windows boarded up, a reminder that medieval medicine was less about healing and more about surviving long enough to collect your fee and escape town before the consequences caught up with you. Tomorrow you'll face another patient, another family, another opportunity to accidentally commit manslaughter with medieval medical techniques that were about as scientifically sound as reading chicken entrails for weather predictions. You stare at the ceramic flask in your trembling hands, its contents swirling like liquid amber in the candlelight. The merchant's wife watches you expectantly, waiting for your diagnosis. But all you can think about is the last time you tasted urine from a plague victim. The memory of that metallic, putrid flavor still haunts your nightmares, along with the fever that nearly killed you 3 days later. Welcome to medieval diagnostic medicine, where your tongue is your most important medical instrument, and possibly your death warrant. The practice of uroscopy wasn't just common in medieval times. It was considered the pinnacle of medical sophistication. Physicians would examine urine color, smell, taste, and even texture to diagnose everything from diabetes to demonic possession. You've been trained to identify 20 different shades of yellow, each supposedly indicating a different ailment. But here's the terrifying reality. Every sample you taste could be your last meal. Medieval medical schools actually had specialized courses in urine tasting, complete with charts showing which flavors corresponded to which diseases. Sweet meant diabetes, bitter indicated liver problems, and metallic suggested blood disorders. What they didn't teach was how to avoid dying from consuming concentrated disease. You bring the flask closer to your lips, knowing that this simple diagnostic procedure has killed more doctors than battlefield surgery. The patient upstairs is burning with fever, her skin covered in suspicious black spots that could indicate anything from food poisoning to the bubonic plague. Her urine might hold the answers you need, but it might also contain enough disease to turn you into tomorrow's patient. The irony is that medieval physicians believed they were practicing cutting-edge medicine, when in reality they were essentially playing biological Russian roulette with every diagnosis. The most disturbing part about uroscopy was how seriously the medical community took it. Physicians would spend years perfecting their palates, learning to distinguish between the subtle flavors of different diseases. Some doctors claimed they could taste pregnancy in urine weeks before any other symptoms appeared. Others boasted about detecting mental illness through bitter undertones that supposedly indicated an imbalance of melancholic humors. The reality was that they were consuming concentrated doses of whatever pathogens were ravaging their patients' bodies, essentially giving themselves a master class in medieval disease transmission. You take the smallest possible sip, just enough to coat your tongue, and immediately your stomach lurches. The taste is wrong, not just unpleasant, but wrong in a way that makes your medical training scream warnings. There's a metallic undertone that suggests blood, a sweetness that could indicate the sweating sickness, and an underlying bitterness that might mean poison. Or it could just be the taste of concentrated human waste, because let's be honest, that's essentially what you're sampling for breakfast. your colleague Thomas died last winter after diagnosing a series of patients with mysterious fevers. He was meticulous about his urine tasting, prided himself on his refined palate for detecting illness. The problem was that all those patients had been poisoned by contaminated well water, and Thomas essentially gave himself a concentrated dose of the same toxins that killed them. They found him 3 days later, dead in his study, surrounded by medical texts and empty urine flasks. His final notes described the fascinating complexity of the flavors he'd been analyzing, completely unaware that he was documenting his own poisoning. The merchant's wife leans forward anxiously as you swirl the liquid again, pretending to analyze its consistency while actually trying not to vomit. Medieval medical texts described urine analysis as an art form, with physicians developing sophisticated charts correlating taste, color, and smell with specific diagnoses. The famous physician Theophilus wrote extensively about the wine-like qualities of diabetic urine and the earthy flavors associated with kidney disease. What those texts failed to mention was the occupational hazard of consuming bodily fluids from people dying of infectious diseases. The strangest part about medieval uroscopy was how it became a status symbol among physicians. Doctors would compete to see who could make the most accurate diagnoses based purely on urine taste, turning medical practice into a grotesque wine-tasting competition. Some physicians claimed they could determine not just current illnesses but predict future health problems based on subtle flavor profiles. The most successful uroscopists commanded premium fees and were sought after by nobility who wanted the most sophisticated medical care available. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians actually believed urine tasting was medically sound or if they were just following ancient traditions too dangerous to question. The practice dated back to ancient Greek medicine, where physicians would taste everything from blood to breast milk for diagnostic purposes. By medieval times, uroscopy had become so refined that some doctors claimed they could determine a patient's entire medical history from a single sample. The irony is that while they were developing increasingly sophisticated theories about urine analysis, they were completely ignorant about basic concepts like infection control and disease transmission. You set down the flask and deliver your diagnosis with as much confidence as you can muster, knowing that you're essentially guessing based on a mouthful of potentially lethal bodily fluid. The merchant's wife nods solemnly, trusting your medical expertise completely, unaware that you just risked your life to tell her something you could have determined by simply looking at her daughter's symptoms. You prescribe a combination of bloodletting and herbal remedies, standard treatments that are probably just as dangerous as the diagnostic process itself. The walk to your next patient feels like a funeral march, the taste of disease still lingering on your tongue despite multiple attempts to rinse it away with wine. You pass the apothecary's shop where they sell those newfangled glass tubes for urine examination, devices that would let you analyze samples without actually consuming them. But such innovations are considered newfangled nonsense by the medical establishment, who insists that true diagnosis requires intimate knowledge of bodily fluids through direct consumption. You wonder how many more patients you can diagnose before your luck runs out, before you taste the wrong sample and join the growing list of physicians who died practicing the very medicine they thought would save lives. You grip the bone saw with white knuckles, its serrated edge gleaming in the flickering torchlight of the makeshift operating chamber. The merchant writhing on the wooden table before you has a leg so infected that black veins spider up from his ankle like death's own roadmap. Without anesthesia, Without proper surgical knowledge, and certainly without any real hope of success, you're about to attempt an amputation that will either save his life or turn you into a murderer in the eyes of his screaming family. The sound that escapes from medieval surgery isn't something you ever get used to. It's a symphony of agony that would make demons weep. You've performed dozens of operations, and each one haunts your sleep with memories of patients thrashing against leather restraints while you sawed through bone and muscle with tools that belonged more in a carpenter's workshop than a medical practice. The worst part isn't the blood or the smell of burning flesh when you cauterize wounds with red-hot irons. It's the moment when you realize the patient has stopped screaming, and you're not sure if that's because they've passed out from pain or because they've passed into the afterlife. Medieval surgery was essentially legalized torture with good intentions. You learned your craft by watching other physicians hack through limbs and organs with the same precision most people used to butcher livestock. There were no medical schools teaching proper surgical technique, no understanding of infection control, and certainly no concept of patient comfort during procedures. Your surgical education consisted of memorizing ancient texts that described operations performed on gladiators and criminals, then trying to apply those techniques to paying customers who expected to survive the experience. The merchant's wife clutches a wooden crucifix, praying loudly while her husband's screams echo off the stone walls. You position the saw just above the infected area, knowing that you have perhaps 10 minutes before blood loss or shock kills your patient. Medieval surgical mortality rates were astronomical. Some estimates suggest that up to 70% of major operations resulted in death, either during the procedure or from infections that developed afterward. You're not performing surgery so much as participating in a ritualized form of homicide with medical justification. You begin cutting, and immediately the patient's body convulses with such violence that your assistants struggle to hold him down. Medieval physicians had access to some pain-relieving substances, opium, mandrake, and various herbal concoctions, but these were expensive, unreliable, and often more dangerous than the surgery itself. Most operations were performed on fully conscious patients who were simply held down by strong men while the physician worked as quickly as possible. The phrase, "bite the bullet," originated from this era, when patients would literally bite down on leather or metal objects to avoid biting off their own tongues during surgery. Your colleague Robert died last month after attempting to remove kidney stones from a wealthy nobleman. The operation itself was successful, but the patient died 3 days later from what we now know was septic shock. The nobleman's family didn't care about medical complications. They saw a healthy man enter Robert's surgical chamber and a corpse leave it. Robert was found hanging from a tree outside the city walls, a victim of medieval malpractice justice that made no distinction between surgical complications and deliberate murder. The bone finally separates with a sickening crack, and you quickly move to cauterize the wound with a glowing iron rod. The smell of burning flesh fills the chamber as the patient's screams reach a pitch that seems to shake the very foundations of the building. Medieval cauterization was the only method available for stopping severe bleeding, but it often caused more damage than the original injury. You're essentially burning your patient's flesh to seal blood vessels, a technique that frequently led to massive infections and tissue death. Historians still argue whether medieval surgeons were brave pioneers pushing the boundaries of medical knowledge or desperate butchers who killed more patients than they saved. The surgical texts of the time described elaborate procedures for everything from cataract removal to brain surgery, but the mortality rates suggest that most of these operations were essentially death sentences with medical terminology. The most successful medieval surgeons were often those who refused to perform the most dangerous procedures, leaving their patients to die naturally rather than accelerating the process through surgical intervention. You finish the amputation and step back, covered in blood and exhausted from the physical and emotional strain of essentially torturing someone in the name of medicine. The patient has mercifully lost consciousness, his breathing shallow but steady. Whether he survives the next few days depends entirely on luck, his constitution, and whether infection sets in around the cauterized wound. You've done everything medieval medical knowledge allows, which unfortunately isn't very much. The merchant's family gathers around the unconscious patient, their faces a mixture of hope and barely contained rage. They're calculating the odds of their patriarch's survival, and your future depends entirely on those calculations. If he lives, you'll be hailed as a miracle worker and paid handsomely for your services. If he dies, you'll be lucky to escape the city with your life, assuming they don't decide to give you a taste of your own surgical techniques. You pack your blood-soaked instruments while trying to ignore the patient's labored breathing and the family's whispered conversations about what happens to physicians who kill their patients. Tomorrow you'll face another surgical emergency, another opportunity to accidentally commit homicide with medieval medical techniques that were about as scientifically advanced as using leeches to cure depression, which, coincidentally, was also a popular treatment option. The walk home feels like a death march, your surgical bag heavy with instruments that feel more like evidence of crimes against humanity than tools of healing. You stare at the collection of glass vials arranged on your wooden workbench, each one containing a different shade of death disguised as medicine. The mercury gleams like liquid silver, beautiful and mesmerizing, while the arsenic powder sits innocuously white as fresh snow. These are your healing remedies, your weapons against disease, and quite possibly the instruments of your own professional suicide. Every time you mix these concoctions, you're playing a deadly game where the difference between cure and poison is measured in grains so small that a sneeze could turn medicine into murder. Medieval pharmacology was essentially a sophisticated form of Russian roulette with prettier packaging. You've spent years studying the ancient texts that describe the healing properties of mercury, lead, arsenic, and other substances that modern medicine recognizes as lethal toxins. The irony would be hilarious if it weren't so terrifying. You're literally poisoning people in an attempt to save their lives. And when they inevitably die from your treatments, their families hold you personally responsible for what they consider deliberate murder. The wealthy merchant's daughter lies upstairs, burning with fever from what you've diagnosed as an excess of hot humors. Your prescribed treatment involves a carefully measured dose of mercury mixed with ground pearls and unicorn horn, the latter being narwhal tusk powder that costs more than most people earn in a year. The mercury is supposed to cool her internal fires, but you know from bitter experience that it's just as likely to shut down her kidneys and kill her within days. Medieval medicine operated on the principle that dramatic symptoms required dramatic treatments, which usually meant poisoning patients with increasingly exotic and dangerous substances. You begin grinding the mercury with a mortar and pestle, watching the silvery liquid break into smaller droplets that seem to dance with malevolent life. Mercury was considered a miracle cure in medieval times, prescribed for everything from syphilis to melancholy. What physicians didn't understand was that mercury vapor is highly toxic, and prolonged exposure causes neurological damage, kidney failure, and death. You've seen colleagues develop the telltale tremors and personality changes that indicate mercury poisoning, but they continue using it because the medical establishment considers it essential for treating serious illnesses. Your friend Marcus died last winter after treating a series of patients with mercury-based remedies. He started showing symptoms: trembling hands, difficulty speaking, paranoid delusions, but attributed them to stress from his demanding practice. The final irony was that Marcus diagnosed himself with an imbalance of melancholic humors and prescribed himself even larger doses of mercury to treat his condition. They found him in his laboratory, surrounded by broken glass vials and mercury puddles, having essentially poisoned himself while trying to cure the poisoning he'd given himself. The arsenic powder requires even more careful handling, as a few extra grains can transform a healing remedy into a death sentence. Medieval physicians used arsenic to treat everything from skin conditions to digestive problems, believing that small doses could purge the body of disease-causing impurities. The problem was that the line between therapeutic and lethal doses was thinner than parchment, and there was no reliable way to measure exact quantities. You're essentially guessing how much poison to give each patient, hoping that you'll hit the narrow window between ineffective and fatal. The most terrifying aspect of medieval pharmacology was how confident physicians were in their deadly remedies. Medical texts described elaborate preparation methods for toxic substances, complete with detailed instructions for combining mercury with sulfur, lead with gold, and arsenic with various herbs. These weren't desperate last-resort treatments. They were considered the pinnacle of medical sophistication, prescribed by the most educated and respected physicians of the time. The fact that patients regularly died from these treatments was attributed to the severity of their illnesses, not the toxicity of the cures. You add a pinch of ground emerald to the mixture, another expensive ingredient that's supposed to enhance the mercury's healing properties. Medieval medicine was obsessed with the idea that precious substances possessed magical healing powers, leading to treatments that cost fortunes and killed patients with equal efficiency. Ground pearls for lung problems, powdered gold for heart conditions, crushed diamonds for mental illness. The more expensive the ingredient, the more powerful its supposed healing properties. The reality was that you were essentially feeding people jewelry while slowly poisoning them with toxic metals. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians genuinely believed in the healing properties of toxic substances or if they were trapped by medical traditions too dangerous to question. The use of mercury, lead, and arsenic in medicine persisted for centuries, despite mounting evidence that these treatments were killing more patients than they saved. Some scholars suggest that physicians continued using toxic remedies because admitting their dangers would have undermined the entire foundation of medieval medical practice. You finish preparing the mercury mixture and pour it into a clean vial, knowing that you're about to give a sick child a carefully measured dose of poison in the hope that it will cure rather than kill her. The merchant's family trusts your medical expertise completely, unaware that your healing remedies are more dangerous than the diseases they're meant to treat. You've become an expert in the art of therapeutic poisoning, walking the razor's edge between cure and murder with every prescription you write. The walk upstairs to deliver the medicine feels like climbing the gallows, each step bringing you closer to another potentially fatal medical decision. You wonder how many more patients you can treat before your luck runs out, before you miscalculate a dose and transform from healer to accidental murderer in the eyes of a grieving family who trusted you with their loved one's life. You hear the angry voices before you see the torches, their orange flames dancing like demons in the narrow alleyway behind your house. The baker's son died 3 hours ago, despite your careful treatment with bloodletting and herbal remedies. And now his family has gathered half the neighborhood to discuss your future, or lack thereof. This is the moment every medieval physician dreads, when grief transforms into rage, and suddenly you're not a healer who tried his best, but a murderer who needs to pay for his crimes with blood. The crowd grows larger by the minute, their voices rising in a crescendo of accusations and threats. Medieval justice didn't require courts or evidence when it came to medical malpractice. If a patient died under your care, you were guilty until proven innocent, and proving innocence usually involved running faster than an angry mob carrying farm tools and rope. You've seen this scene play out dozens of times with other physicians, and it never ends well for the doctor. The lucky ones escape with their lives but lose their practices. The unlucky ones become cautionary tales whispered in medical schools about the occupational hazards of trying to heal people with medieval medicine. You peer through the shutters of your second-story window, counting at least 20 people armed with everything from kitchen knives to blacksmith hammers. The baker himself stands at the front of the group, his face twisted with grief and rage, holding the same cleaver he uses to chop meat for his customers. His wife clutches a wooden club, tears streaming down her face as she screams accusations about how you murdered their boy with your devil's medicine. The irony is that you actually helped the child. His fever broke yesterday, and he was sitting up and eating soup. Then he suddenly collapsed and died, probably from complications you had no way of predicting or preventing. Medieval medicine placed impossible expectations on physicians, demanding miracle cures for diseases that wouldn't be understood for centuries. When patients died, and they died frequently, families needed someone to blame, and the doctor was always the most convenient target. You weren't just treating illnesses. You were accepting responsibility for outcomes completely beyond your control, knowing that failure meant facing the wrath of people who had lost everything and wanted someone to pay for their pain. Your colleague William faced a similar mob last spring after losing 3 patients in a single week to what we now know was probably typhoid fever. The families didn't care about disease outbreaks or medical limitations. They saw a pattern of death following William's treatments and concluded he was either incompetent or evil. They cornered him in his own home, and by morning, William's body was hanging from the town gibbet with a sign reading, "Child Killer," pinned to his chest. The local authorities ruled it justifiable homicide, claiming that William had clearly been practicing witchcraft disguised as medicine. The crowd outside begins chanting your name, but not in a good way. They're calling for justice, demanding that you face them like a man and answer for your crimes against their children. Medieval mobs operated on a simple principle. If someone died after receiving medical treatment, the physician was responsible, regardless of the circumstances. There was no concept of natural death, medical complications, or the limitations of contemporary medicine. Every death was someone's fault, and physicians were the easiest targets for communities desperate to assign blame for their losses. You grab your emergency bag. Every smart medieval physician kept one packed with essential supplies and enough money to start over in a new city. The bag contains fake documents with a different name, a change of clothes, and a small fortune in silver coins earned from years of risking your life to treat ungrateful patients who would happily murder you if their loved ones died despite your best efforts. This isn't your first midnight escape, and it probably won't be your last, assuming you survive long enough to establish another practice somewhere else. The voices grow louder, more organized, as someone takes charge of the mob and begins directing them toward your front door. Medieval physician mobility was a survival skill. You learned early in your career to maintain multiple escape routes, keep your affairs in order, and never get too attached to any particular location. The most successful doctors were often those who moved frequently, staying ahead of their reputations and the inevitable accusations that followed medical failures. Historians still argue whether medieval mobs were justified in their violence against physicians or if they were simply scapegoating doctors for deaths caused by diseases beyond contemporary medical understanding. The mortality rates of the time were staggering. Infant mortality alone was over 50% in most communities. But people needed someone to blame for their losses, and physicians were convenient targets who charged money for services that often failed to save lives. You hear the first crash as they break down your front door, their angry voices echoing through the house as they search for the man they hold responsible for their grief. The irony is that you genuinely tried to help the baker's son, using the best medical knowledge available in your time. But medieval medicine was so primitive that your best efforts were often indistinguishable from deliberate harm. You climb out the back window and drop into the alley, landing hard on the cobblestones but grateful to be alive and mobile. The escape route you've planned leads through the cemetery and into the forest beyond, where you can hide until the mob loses interest or moves on to blame someone else for their troubles. You've done this dance before: flee in the night, establish a new identity in a distant city, and start over with a different name and the same dangerous profession that might kill you through medical complications or angry families seeking revenge for losses you couldn't prevent. You crouch in the shadows of the cathedral crypt, your hands trembling as you carefully peel back the skin from a corpse's arm, knowing that discovery means certain death at the stake. The candlelight flickers across the dead man's face, a beggar who died of natural causes, or so you hope, while you desperately try to understand how the human body actually works. This is medieval medical education at its most dangerous: grave robbing, corpse dissection, and the constant terror of being caught practicing what the Church considers the darkest form of witchcraft. The irony of medieval medicine was that physicians were expected to heal bodies they weren't allowed to study. Church doctrine declared that dissecting human corpses was an abomination against God, a desecration of the divine temple that would damn your soul to eternal hellfire. Yet how could you possibly treat diseases, set bones, or perform surgery without understanding basic human anatomy? You're caught in an impossible bind: remain ignorant and kill patients through incompetence, or gain knowledge and risk being burned alive as a heretic who traffics with demons. Your makeshift anatomy lesson is interrupted by footsteps echoing through the stone corridors above. Every sound makes your heart race, knowing that discovery would mean facing the Inquisition's special attention to physicians who practice forbidden medicine. The Church maintained that God intended human bodies to remain mysteries, and any attempt to peer inside them was tantamount to challenging divine will. Medieval physicians who were caught dissecting corpses faced charges of witchcraft, heresy, and consorting with evil spirits, accusations that carried automatic death sentences with no possibility of appeal. The corpse before you tells a story that contradicts everything you learned in medical school. The heart isn't where the ancient texts claimed it should be, the liver is shaped nothing like the diagrams you memorized, and the network of blood vessels bears no resemblance to the illustrations copied from Greek manuscripts written by physicians who probably never dissected a human body themselves. You're discovering that medieval medical education was essentially an elaborate game of telephone, with each generation of doctors passing down anatomical errors that had been accumulating for centuries. Your colleague Andreas was caught performing a dissection last year in the basement of his home. The local priest discovered him hunched over a merchant's corpse, carefully examining the man's internal organs by candlelight. Andreas tried to explain that he was attempting to understand why the merchant had died despite receiving proper medical treatment, but the church authorities weren't interested in his scientific curiosity. They burned Andreas alive in the town square, declaring him a necromancer who had sold his soul to Satan in exchange for forbidden knowledge about the human body. The most terrifying aspect of clandestine anatomy wasn't the risk of discovery. It was realizing how wrong medieval medicine actually was. Every corpse you dissected revealed new evidence that the foundational principles of your profession were based on centuries of accumulated ignorance. The four humors theory made no sense when you could see actual organs and blood vessels. The idea that illness was caused by imbalanced bodily fluids seemed ridiculous when you observed the complex reality of human anatomy. You were essentially practicing medicine based on fairy tales, and your patients were paying the price for your profession's willful ignorance. You carefully examined the corpse's lungs, noting how different they looked from the ancient illustrations that showed them as simple bags filled with air. Medieval medical texts described lungs as cooling organs that balanced the heart's heat, but the reality was far more complex and fascinating. The intricate network of blood vessels and air passages suggested that breathing involved mechanisms that medieval physicians didn't even suspect existed. Every anatomical discovery made you realize how little you actually knew about the bodies you were supposed to heal. The Church's prohibition against human dissection wasn't just about religious doctrine. It was about maintaining the medical establishment's authority. If physicians started questioning anatomical knowledge based on direct observation, they might begin doubting other aspects of medieval medicine. The entire system depended on unquestioning acceptance of ancient authorities. An empirical investigation threatened to expose how much of medical practice was based on speculation rather than evidence. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians who practiced secret anatomy were brave pioneers of scientific medicine or desperate practitioners trying to improve their abysmal success rates. The few anatomical texts that survived from this period show remarkable accuracy compared to official medical knowledge, suggesting that some physicians were willing to risk their lives to gain real understanding of human anatomy. These clandestine anatomists laid the groundwork for the medical revolution that would eventually transform medicine from guesswork into science. You hear voices getting closer and quickly begin wrapping the corpse in its burial shroud, erasing evidence of your forbidden medical education. The knowledge you've gained tonight might help you save future patients, but it also makes you complicit in activities that the Church considers worse than murder. You're not just risking your life to practice medicine. You're risking your immortal soul to gain knowledge that might make you a better physician. The walk home through empty streets feels like a funeral procession, your mind reeling with anatomical revelations that contradict everything you were taught about human bodies. You wonder how many other physicians are conducting secret dissections, building real medical knowledge while publicly maintaining the fiction that ancient texts contain all the anatomical wisdom anyone needs. The most successful medieval doctors might be those brave enough to risk damnation in pursuit of actual medical understanding. You watch the barber surgeon across the street sharpen his razor while a line of customers waits patiently for his services, and your stomach churns with a mixture of professional outrage and genuine terror. This man, who learned his medical skills between haircuts and beard trims, is stealing your patience with promises of cheaper treatments and faster results. The problem isn't just the competition, it's that his crude, brutal methods are often more effective than your sophisticated university education, and when his patients survive while yours die, your reputation crumbles faster than week-old bread. Medieval medicine created the perfect storm of professional rivalry by allowing multiple types of practitioners to compete for the same patients. You spent years studying ancient Greek texts, memorizing complex theories about bodily humors, and learning to diagnose diseases through urine tasting and astrological calculations. Meanwhile, the barber surgeon learned his trade through apprenticeship, focusing on practical skills like tooth extraction, wound treatment, and basic surgery. The cruel irony is that his hands-on experience often produces better results than your theoretical knowledge, making him a deadly threat to your livelihood and reputation. The barber surgeon's shop displays a red and white striped pole that advertises his willingness to perform bloodletting, tooth pulling, and minor surgery alongside his grooming services. Medieval patients didn't distinguish between different types of medical practitioners. They simply wanted relief from pain and illness at the lowest possible cost. When the barber surgeon could extract an infected tooth for a few copper coins while you charged silver for a complex diagnosis involving planetary alignments and herbal remedies, guess who got the business? Your expensive education meant nothing to patients who just wanted their problems solved quickly and affordably. You remember the humiliation of losing the merchant's wife to the barber surgeon last month. She came to you first, complaining of severe tooth pain that kept her awake at night. You diagnosed an excess of hot humors in her jaw and prescribed a complex treatment involving bloodletting, herbal poultices, and dietary changes that would take weeks to show results. The barber surgeon simply yanked out the infected tooth with a pair of pliers, charged her a fraction of your fee, and sent her home pain-free within minutes. When word spread about the dramatic difference in results, half your patients defected to his shop. The most infuriating aspect of competing with barber surgeons was that they often succeeded where university-trained physicians failed. Their crude methods, pulling teeth, lancing boils, setting broken bones, addressed immediate problems with immediate solutions. Your sophisticated approach involved complex diagnoses, expensive treatments, and theoretical explanations that patients couldn't understand or afford. Medieval medicine rewarded practical results over academic credentials, and barber surgeons delivered results that patients could see and feel immediately. Your colleague Marcus tried to eliminate his barber surgeon competition through legal action, claiming that unlicensed medical practice violated guild regulations and endangered public health. The local authorities laughed at his complaint, pointing out that the barber surgeon's patients were recovering while Marcus's were dying at alarming rates. The case was dismissed, and Marcus found himself facing a countersuit for defamation when the barber surgeon's patients testified about their successful treatments compared to Marcus's expensive failures. The professional sabotage between physicians and barber surgeons sometimes escalated beyond mere competition into actual warfare. You've heard stories of physicians bribing patients to claim that barber surgeons had injured them, while barber surgeons spread rumors that university-trained doctors were incompetent theorists who killed patients with overcomplicated treatments. Some physicians allegedly poisoned barber surgeons' medical supplies, while barber surgeons retaliated by stealing patients and undercutting prices to drive physicians out of business. The economic reality of medieval medicine made this competition particularly vicious. There weren't enough wealthy patients to support multiple medical practitioners in most communities, so physicians and barber surgeons fought over a limited customer base. When a barber surgeon could perform basic surgery, extract teeth, and treat wounds for a fraction of what physicians charged, the economic advantage was overwhelming. Your expensive education became a liability rather than an asset when patients could get better results for less money from someone who learned medicine as a side business to cutting hair. Historians still argue whether the competition between physicians and barber surgeons improved medieval medical care by encouraging innovation and lower prices, or if it degraded the profession by rewarding crude techniques over sophisticated knowledge. The evidence suggests that barber surgeons often achieved better outcomes than university-trained physicians, partly because their practical approach avoided some of the more dangerous theoretical treatments that killed patients in the name of balancing humors and correcting astrological influences. You watch another potential patient enter the barber surgeon's shop, knowing that your competitor will probably solve their problem more effectively and affordably than you could with your complex diagnostic procedures and expensive remedies. The irony is that your superior education makes you a worse physician in practical terms, burdening you with theoretical knowledge that interferes with common-sense treatments. Medieval medicine punished physicians for knowing too much while rewarding barber surgeons for keeping things simple and practical. The rivalry has become so intense that you've considered abandoning your medical practice entirely and opening a competing barber shop, using your anatomical knowledge to offer superior grooming services while secretly practicing medicine on the side. The idea of becoming the very thing you've been trained to despise represents the ultimate professional humiliation, but it might be the only way to survive in a medical marketplace that rewards practical results over academic credentials. You kneel before the golden throne, your hands trembling as you prepare to examine the most dangerous patient in the kingdom, the king himself. His fever has persisted for 3 days, and the royal court watches your every move with the intensity of vultures circling a dying animal. This isn't just a medical consultation. It's a high-stakes game where the wrong diagnosis means your head decorating a spike outside the castle walls. Royal medicine was the ultimate test of medieval physician survival skills, where political savvy mattered more than medical knowledge, and one misinterpreted symptom could transform you from court physician to court corpse. The pressure of treating royalty went far beyond normal medical practice. When you treated peasants or merchants, failure meant angry families and potential mob violence. When you treated kings, failure meant systematic torture followed by public execution, with your family thrown in for good measure. Medieval monarchs didn't just expect medical miracles, they demanded them, and physicians who couldn't deliver faced consequences that made ordinary malpractice seem like gentle criticism. You're not just diagnosing illness, you're navigating a minefield of royal expectations, court politics, and the absolute power of life and death held by someone whose mood swings could be more dangerous than any disease. The king's symptoms present a diagnostic nightmare wrapped in political implications. His fever could indicate anything from simple food poisoning to the plague, but each potential diagnosis carries different political consequences. If you suggest he's been poisoned, you're implying that his security has failed and enemies have infiltrated the royal household. If you diagnose a contagious disease, you're essentially declaring that the king is a threat to his own court. If you claim it's a minor ailment, you risk being wrong when his condition worsens. Medieval royal medicine required you to be simultaneously a physician, diplomat, and fortune-teller, predicting not just medical outcomes but political ramifications. Your predecessor, Dr. Aldrich, made the fatal mistake of suggesting that the previous king's chest pains were caused by an excess of melancholic humors brought on by stress from governing. The king interpreted this as criticism of his leadership abilities and had Aldrich drawn and quartered for insubordination disguised as medical diagnosis. The lesson was clear. Royal patients wanted to hear that their illnesses were caused by external factors, poison, witchcraft, or divine testing, never by personal failings or lifestyle choices that might reflect poorly on their character or competence. The court physicians who survived longest were those who mastered the art of medical diplomacy, crafting diagnoses that flattered royal egos while providing plausible explanations for illness. You've learned to blame mysterious foreign poisons, enemy sorcerers, or divine trials that test the king's worthiness to rule. These explanations allow monarchs to maintain their image of invincibility while giving you cover if treatments fail. The most successful royal physicians were often the most creative storytellers, spinning medical narratives that satisfied political requirements regardless of actual medical accuracy. The king's advisors hover nearby, each one calculating how your diagnosis might affect their own political positions. If you declare the king's illness serious, the succession question becomes immediate, and various factions will begin positioning themselves for power struggles. If you claim it's minor, you risk being blamed if he dies unexpectedly. Medieval court medicine was as much about managing political consequences as treating medical symptoms, and physicians who ignored the political implications of their diagnoses rarely lived long enough to regret their naivety. You begin your examination, knowing that every word you speak will be analyzed for hidden meanings and political implications. The king's pulse is rapid and weak, his skin flushed with fever, and his breathing labored, symptoms that could indicate dozens of different conditions. But your diagnosis must satisfy not just medical requirements but also political necessities, royal expectations, and the competing interests of various court factions who will use your words to advance their own agendas. The most terrifying aspect of royal medicine was the absolute nature of monarchical power. Kings could order your execution on a whim, without trial or appeal, and their decisions were considered divinely inspired and therefore unquestionable. You've seen court physicians disappear overnight for offenses as minor as suggesting that royal lifestyle choices might contribute to health problems. Medieval monarchs viewed their bodies as extensions of their divine authority, and any suggestion that they were subject to ordinary human frailties was considered treasonous. Historians still argue whether medieval royal physicians were skilled medical practitioners or simply political survivors who happened to have medical training. The evidence suggests that successful court physicians were often those who prioritized political survival over medical accuracy, crafting diagnoses and treatments that satisfied royal expectations rather than addressing actual health problems. The most medically competent physicians sometimes failed at court because they couldn't navigate the political complexities of treating patients who held absolute power over life and death. You formulate your diagnosis carefully, choosing words that will flatter the king's ego while providing medical cover for potential treatment failures. The fever, you explain, is clearly the result of a foreign poison administered by enemy agents who fear his military prowess. This explanation makes the king a victim rather than a patient, suggests that his enemies consider him dangerous enough to assassinate, and provides justification for any treatment failures by blaming them on the exotic nature of foreign toxins. The king's face brightens at your diagnosis, pleased to hear that his illness is evidence of his importance rather than a sign of human frailty. The court advisors nod approvingly, recognizing that your explanation supports their own political narratives about foreign threats and royal invincibility. You've successfully navigated the first challenge of royal medicine, providing a diagnosis that satisfies political requirements while giving yourself room to maneuver if the treatment fails. You feel death's cold breath on your neck as you lean over the plague victim's bed, knowing that every moment spent in this fetid chamber brings you closer to joining your patient in the grave. The black boils covering her skin seem to pulse with malevolent life, and the sweet stench of decay fills your nostrils despite the leather-beaked mask that's supposed to protect you from the pestilence. This is the ultimate nightmare of medieval medicine, treating patients whose diseases are so contagious that simply being in the same room transforms you from healer to future corpse, yet refusing to treat them means abandoning your oath and facing professional ruin. The plague wasn't just a disease in medieval times. It was a death sentence that physicians were expected to treat despite having no effective remedies and no understanding of how it spread. You've watched colleagues die horrible deaths after treating plague victims, their bodies covered in the same black boils they tried to cure in others. The irony is that medieval medicine demanded physicians risk their lives to provide treatments that were completely useless, essentially asking doctors to commit suicide in service of patients they couldn't possibly save. Your leather plague doctor costume feels like a funeral shroud as you examine the woman's swollen lymph nodes, knowing that the aromatic herbs stuffed in your beak mask provide about as much protection as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. Medieval physicians believed that plague was spread through bad air or miasma, so they developed elaborate protective costumes designed to filter out poisonous vapors. The reality was that plague was spread by fleas carrying bacteria, making your costume completely ineffective while creating a terrifying appearance that probably scared patients more than it helped them. The patient's breathing becomes more labored as you watch, her skin taking on the grayish pallor that indicates approaching death. Medieval plague treatment involved bloodletting, herbal remedies, and prayers, none of which had any effect on bacterial infections that required antibiotics that wouldn't be discovered for centuries. You're essentially performing elaborate rituals while watching people die, knowing that your presence probably increases their suffering without providing any medical benefit whatsoever. Your colleague Thomas died last week after treating a family of plague victims in the merchant quarter. He followed all the prescribed protective measures, wore the full leather costume, carried aromatic herbs, and maintained proper distance from patients, but still contracted the disease and died within days. The cruel irony was that Thomas had actually been making progress with other types of patients, developing innovative surgical techniques and herbal remedies that showed real promise. The plague killed him just as he was becoming a genuinely effective physician. The most terrifying aspect of plague medicine was how it exposed the complete helplessness of medieval medical practice. With other diseases, physicians could at least pretend their treatments might work, maintaining the illusion that they were providing valuable services. plague stripped away all pretense, revealing medieval medicine as an elaborate charade performed by people who had no real understanding of disease or effective treatments. You were essentially actors in a medical theater, going through the motions of healing while everyone involved knew the performance was meaningless. The woman's family watches from the doorway, their faces masks of terror and desperate hope. They know that calling a physician to treat plague is probably futile, but they can't bear to watch their loved one die without attempting some form of medical intervention. Medieval families faced impossible choices during plague outbreaks: risk exposing themselves and their physicians to deadly disease, or accept that their relatives would die without any attempt at treatment. Most chose to risk everything for the slim chance that medical intervention might save their loved ones. You prescribed the standard plague treatments: bloodletting to balance the humors, herbal poultices to draw out the poison, and prayers to various saints who supposedly protected against pestilence. These remedies are completely useless against bacterial infections, but they're all medieval medicine has to offer. The family nods gratefully, clinging to the hope that your treatments might work where countless others have failed. You don't have the heart to tell them that you're essentially performing last rites disguised as medical care. The economic reality of plague medicine was particularly cruel. Physicians charged premium rates for treating plague victims, knowing that desperate families would pay anything for hope of saving their loved ones. Yet these expensive treatments were completely ineffective, making plague medicine a form of legalized fraud that exploited human desperation during the worst possible circumstances. You're taking money from grieving families in exchange for useless remedies that provide false hope while exposing yourself to deadly disease. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians who treated plague victims were heroic figures who risked their lives in service of others, or if they were simply fulfilling professional obligations that required them to provide ineffective treatments for diseases they couldn't understand or cure. The mortality rates among plague doctors were astronomical, suggesting that many physicians essentially committed suicide by continuing to practice medicine during epidemic outbreaks. You finish your examination and prepare to leave, knowing that the woman will probably be dead within hours regardless of your treatments. The walk home feels like a death march, your plague costume marking you as someone who has been exposed to the most feared disease of medieval times. Other people crossed the street to avoid you, recognizing that plague doctors were often walking disease vectors who carried death from house to house despite their best intentions. The irony of medieval plague medicine was that physicians often became the very agents of the disease they were trying to combat. By moving from patient to patient, they inadvertently spread plague throughout communities while believing they were providing essential medical services. Your healing mission has transformed you into an unwitting angel of death, carrying pestilence in your wake, while desperately trying to save lives with treatments that couldn't possibly work. You frantically calculate planetary alignments while your patient bleeds out on the wooden table, knowing that medieval medicine demands you wait for the perfect astrological moment before attempting any serious treatment. The merchant's wife has been stabbed in a tavern brawl, and every second of delay brings her closer to death. But your medical training insists that operating during an unfavorable celestial configuration will guarantee failure and probably kill both of you through cosmic retribution. This is the insane reality of medieval medical practice, where astronomical calculations mattered more than immediate medical needs, and physicians were expected to be fortune-tellers as much as healers. Medieval medicine was utterly obsessed with astrological timing, believing that the positions of planets and stars determined the success or failure of every medical intervention. You've memorized complex charts showing which celestial configurations favor bloodletting, when surgical procedures should be performed, and which planetary alignments make herbal remedies more effective. The problem is that medical emergencies don't wait for favorable horoscopes, and patients often died while physicians consulted star charts to determine the optimal moment for treatment. The woman's breathing becomes more shallow as you desperately try to calculate whether Mars is in the correct position relative to Jupiter to allow for wound treatment. Medieval medical schools taught that each part of the human body was governed by specific celestial bodies: the head by Aries, the heart by Leo, the liver by Jupiter, and treating any organ during unfavorable planetary conditions was considered medical suicide. You're essentially practicing astrology with surgical instruments, trying to heal bodies according to cosmic schedules that have nothing to do with actual medical needs. Your colleague Robert died last month after attempting surgery during what the astrological charts indicated was a favorable celestial configuration. The patient survived the operation, but Robert developed a mysterious fever 3 days later and died within a week. The medical community blamed his death on miscalculating the planetary positions, claiming that he must have operated during an inauspicious moment that brought cosmic punishment upon him. The idea that he might have contracted an infection from unsanitary surgical conditions never occurred to anyone. Medieval medicine preferred supernatural explanations to practical ones. The most ridiculous aspect of astrological medicine was how it created impossible scheduling conflicts between cosmic timing and medical necessity. Patients with broken bones had to wait for favorable planetary alignments before physicians would set their fractures, often resulting in permanent deformities when bones healed incorrectly during the delay. Women in difficult labor were told to wait for astrologically appropriate moments before physicians would assist with delivery, leading to deaths that could have been prevented with immediate intervention. You check your astrolabe again, trying to determine the exact position of the moon relative to the patient's astrological sign, while she continues bleeding from her stab wound. Medieval physicians carried astronomical instruments as essential medical equipment, spending as much time studying celestial mechanics as human anatomy. The irony was that these elaborate calculations were completely irrelevant to medical outcomes, but physicians who ignored astrological considerations were considered reckless practitioners who endangered their patients through cosmic negligence. The woman's husband pleads with you to ignore the stars and just treat his wife's wound, but you know that operating during an unfavorable astrological moment could result in accusations of malpractice if she dies. Medieval medical law held physicians responsible for following proper astrological procedures, and families could sue for damages if they could prove that treatments were performed during cosmically inappropriate times. You're caught between immediate medical necessity and professional liability, knowing that either choice could result in disaster. The economic pressure of astrological medicine was particularly cruel. Wealthy patients could afford to wait for favorable planetary alignments, paying physicians to monitor celestial conditions and schedule treatments during optimal cosmic moments. Poor patients often died during the waiting periods, unable to afford the luxury of astrologically timed medical care. Medieval medicine created a two-tiered system where the rich received cosmically optimized treatments while the poor got whatever medical attention was available during emergencies. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians genuinely believed in astrological medicine or if they used cosmic timing as a way to delay dangerous procedures until patients either recovered naturally or died without medical intervention. Some evidence suggests that smart physicians used astrological requirements to avoid performing risky operations, blaming unfavorable planetary conditions when they suspected that medical intervention would be more harmful than helpful. You finally decide to ignore the astrological charts and treat the woman's wound immediately, knowing that she'll certainly die if you wait for the stars to align properly. This decision violates everything you were taught about proper medical practice. But common sense suggests that stopping bleeding is more important than cosmic timing. You begin cleaning and suturing the wound, praying that your violation of astrological protocol won't result in supernatural punishment or professional ruin. The woman's breathing stabilizes as you complete the suturing, and her pulse grows stronger with each passing minute. Your decision to ignore astrological timing appears to have saved her life, but you know that if she develops complications or dies later, the medical community will blame your failure to follow proper cosmic procedures. Medieval medicine punished physicians for using common sense when it conflicted with astrological requirements, creating a system where practical medical decisions were considered professional misconduct. The walk home feels like a journey through a universe where medical practice is governed by celestial mechanics rather than human physiology, where physicians must be astronomers before they can be healers, and where the positions of distant planets matter more than the immediate needs of dying patients lying on your table. You discover the vial of nightshade in your medical bag where wolfsbane should be, and your blood turns to ice as you realize that someone has systematically replaced your healing herbs with deadly poisons. This isn't an accident or a supplier's mistake. This is deliberate sabotage designed to transform you from physician to mass murderer with your next prescription. Medieval medical competition wasn't just about stealing patients or undercutting prices. It was warfare conducted with toxic substances, where rival physicians would literally poison each other's supplies to eliminate competition and destroy reputations through spectacular treatment failures. The guild wars between different medical practitioners created a climate of paranoia and sabotage that made practicing medicine feel like navigating a battlefield filled with invisible enemies. You've heard whispered stories of physicians who discovered mercury in their herbal remedies, arsenic mixed with their pain-relieving compounds, and deadly mushrooms substituted for healing fungi. These weren't random acts of malice. They were calculated attacks designed to kill patients in ways that would implicate the targeted physician, destroying both their practice and their life through accusations of deliberate murder. Your hands shake as you examine each vial in your collection, trying to identify which substances have been tampered with and which might still be safe to use. The nightshade looks almost identical to the belladonna you use for treating eye conditions, but one is a carefully measured medicine while the other is a fast-acting poison that would kill patients within hours. Medieval medical sabotage was particularly insidious because the perpetrators understood exactly which substitutions would be most difficult to detect and most likely to cause fatal treatment failures. The most terrifying aspect of medical guild warfare was how it exploited the inherent dangers of medieval medicine to create plausible deniability. When patients died from poison remedies, the deaths looked like ordinary treatment failures rather than deliberate murders. Rival physicians could eliminate competition while maintaining their own reputations, claiming that their colleagues were simply incompetent rather than victims of systematic sabotage. The line between medical malpractice and assassination became completely blurred when healing substances could be weaponized so easily. You remember Dr. Marcus, who lost 3 patients in a single week to what appeared to be adverse reactions to standard herbal remedies. The medical community attributed his failures to poor technique or contaminated supplies, but you now suspect that someone had been systematically poisoning his medications. Marcus's reputation was destroyed, his practice collapsed, and he eventually fled the city in disgrace. The physician who took over his most profitable patients, Dr. Aldwin, suddenly became the most successful practitioner in the district, a coincidence that seems far less innocent in retrospect. The economic incentives for medical sabotage were overwhelming in medieval times. There weren't enough wealthy patients to support multiple physicians in most communities, so eliminating competition through poisoned supplies was often more effective than trying to compete through superior medical skills. A few strategically placed toxic substances could destroy a rival's reputation permanently while creating opportunities for the saboteur to expand their own practice. Medieval medicine rewarded ruthlessness more than competence, and the most successful physicians were often those willing to literally poison their competition. You begin testing each substance in your collection, using techniques you learned from studying toxicology, not for treating poisoned patients, but for protecting yourself from poisoned colleagues. Medieval physicians had to become experts in detecting adulterated medicines, developing elaborate testing procedures to identify contaminated supplies before they killed patients and destroyed reputations. Your medical education now includes lessons in paranoia and chemical analysis that have nothing to do with healing and everything to do with survival in a profession where colleagues might be trying to murder you through your own patients. The psychological warfare of medical sabotage was perhaps worse than the physical danger. You can no longer trust any of your supplies, colleagues, or even patients, knowing that anyone could be part of a conspiracy to destroy your practice through poison remedies. Every treatment becomes a potential trap, every prescription a possible death sentence that could implicate you in murders you didn't commit. Medieval medicine transformed physicians into paranoid investigators, constantly testing their own supplies and questioning the motives of everyone around them. Historians still argue whether medical guild warfare was a widespread phenomenon or isolated incidents blown out of proportion by paranoid physicians who couldn't accept that their treatments were simply ineffective. The evidence suggests that sabotage was common enough that successful physicians routinely took precautions against contaminated supplies, and medical texts from the period include detailed instructions for detecting adulterated medicines. The most successful medieval physicians were often those who survived not just the dangers of practicing primitive medicine, but also the deliberate attacks of colleagues who wanted to eliminate competition. You decide to dispose of your entire medical collection and start over with fresh supplies, knowing that this represents a significant financial loss but recognizing that using contaminated medicines would be professional and literal suicide. The process of rebuilding your pharmaceutical inventory will take weeks and cost a fortune, but it's the only way to ensure that your treatments heal rather than kill. Medieval medicine required physicians to be simultaneously healers, chemists, detectives, and warriors, fighting battles on multiple fronts while trying to maintain the pretense of being dedicated to saving lives. The walk to the apothecary feels like a journey through enemy territory, where every merchant could be selling poisoned supplies and every colleague could be plotting your destruction through contaminated medicines. You wonder how many other physicians are discovering similar sabotage in their own collections, and whether the medical profession has become so corrupted by competition that healing has become secondary to survival in a war where the weapons are the very substances meant to cure disease. You stare at the young woman writhing on the bed, her body contorting in ways that seem to defy human anatomy, while her family insists that she's possessed by demons and demands that you cure her with earthly medicine. Her eyes have rolled back to show only whites. Strange voices emerge from her throat speaking in languages no one recognizes, and she demonstrates impossible strength that requires 3 grown men to restrain her. This is the nightmare scenario that every medieval physician dreads, being expected to treat supernatural afflictions with natural remedies, knowing that failure to cure demonic possession will result in accusations that you're either incompetent or in league with the very demons you're supposed to be fighting. Medieval medicine existed in a world where the supernatural was considered as real and immediate as physical disease, creating impossible expectations for physicians who were supposed to cure everything from broken bones to demonic possession using the same limited arsenal of bloodletting, herbal remedies, and prayers. You've been trained to treat bodily ailments caused by imbalanced humors and astrological influences, but your patients expect you to also combat evil spirits, lift curses, and reverse witchcraft using medical techniques that were never designed for supernatural problems. The girl's condition presents symptoms that could indicate epilepsy, mental illness, or neurological disorders that won't be understood for centuries, but medieval society interprets these manifestations as clear evidence of demonic possession. Her family has already consulted priests who confirm the supernatural diagnosis, and now they expect you to provide medical solutions to a spiritual problem. The irony is that your medical interventions might actually help if her condition has a physical cause, but if she's genuinely possessed by demons, your earthly remedies will be completely useless and might even anger the supernatural forces involved. Your colleague Father Physician Benedict tried to treat a similar case last year using a combination of medical procedures and religious exorcism. He performed bloodletting to balance the patient's humors while simultaneously conducting prayers and rituals to drive out evil spirits. The patient died during the combined treatment, and Benedict was accused of either medical malpractice or inadequate spiritual preparation that allowed the demons to kill their victim rather than be expelled. Medieval medicine created impossible situations where physicians could be blamed for both medical and supernatural failures simultaneously. The most terrifying aspect of treating supposed demonic possession was that success or failure depended entirely on factors beyond medical control. If the patient recovered, you might be credited with miraculous healing abilities that combined medical knowledge with spiritual power. If the patient died or worsened, you could be accused of anything from incompetence to witchcraft, depending on how the family and community interpreted the outcome. Medieval physicians treating supernatural conditions were essentially gambling with their lives on outcomes they couldn't possibly predict or control. You begin your examination, trying to identify physical symptoms that might explain the girl's condition, while her family watches for signs that you're either blessed with healing power or cursed with demonic influence. Medieval medical practice required physicians to navigate the treacherous boundary between natural and supernatural explanations, providing treatments that satisfied both medical theory and religious expectations. You're simultaneously a doctor and an exorcist, expected to cure diseases and cast out demons using techniques that were never designed for such dual purposes. The girl's pulse is rapid and irregular, her breathing labored, and her skin burns with fever, symptoms that suggest a serious physical illness rather than supernatural possession. But medieval medicine made no clear distinction between physical and spiritual causes of disease, believing that demons could cause bodily symptoms and that physical ailments could create spiritual vulnerabilities. You're treating a patient whose condition might be entirely medical, entirely supernatural, or some combination of both that requires interventions you're not qualified to provide. The economic pressure of treating supernatural conditions was particularly intense because families would pay enormous sums for physicians who claimed special abilities to combat demonic possession. Successful treatment of supposed supernatural ailments could establish a physician's reputation as someone with miraculous healing powers, leading to wealthy patients and premium fees. However, failure to cure demonic possession often resulted in accusations that the physician was either incompetent or actively working with evil forces, destroying both reputation and personal safety. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians genuinely believed in demonic possession as a medical condition or if they simply adapted their practice to accommodate popular supernatural beliefs while focusing on treating underlying physical ailments. The evidence suggests that many physicians tried to provide medical explanations for supernatural symptoms, but were forced to incorporate religious elements into their treatments to satisfy patient expectations and avoid accusations of inadequate spiritual preparation. You prescribe a combination of herbal remedies to reduce fever and calm the nervous system, while recommending that the family continue their religious observances and consider consulting additional spiritual authorities. This approach allows you to address potential physical causes of the girl's condition while acknowledging the supernatural elements that the family considers essential to proper treatment. Medieval medicine required physicians to be diplomatic about supernatural diagnoses, providing medical care while respecting religious beliefs that might conflict with natural explanations. The girl's convulsions begin to subside as the herbal sedatives take effect, and her breathing becomes more regular. Whether this improvement results from treating an underlying physical condition or from the combination of medical and spiritual interventions, you'll never know for certain. Medieval physicians treating supernatural conditions rarely received clear feedback about which aspects of their treatments were actually effective, making it impossible to develop reliable protocols for similar cases in the future. The walk home feels like a journey through a world where medicine and magic intersect in ways that make rational diagnosis nearly impossible, where physicians must be prepared to treat both earthly diseases and supernatural afflictions using techniques that were never designed for such comprehensive healing responsibilities. You stand in the doorway of the peasant's hovel, watching the father count out 3 copper coins, his family's last money, while his dying child gasps for breath on a straw mattress. The man's eyes burn with desperation as he explains that this is all he has, but he promises to curse you and your bloodline for 7 generations if you don't save his daughter. This is the economic reality of medieval medicine: patients who can't afford your fees but threaten supernatural vengeance if you refuse to treat them, creating a nightmare scenario where you're damned if you help and damned if you don't. Medieval medical practice operated in a world where payment often came in the form of threats rather than currency, and desperate families would promise everything from eternal damnation to violent revenge if physicians couldn't perform medical miracles with inadequate compensation. You've learned to fear the curses of unpaid patients more than the diseases you're supposed to treat, knowing that medieval society took supernatural threats seriously, and that a reputation for being cursed could destroy your practice faster than any medical malpractice. The peasant's wife clutches a crude wooden doll pierced with thorns, muttering incantations under her breath while glaring at you with eyes that promise terrible consequences if her child dies under your care. Medieval patients often came equipped with folk magic designed to ensure physician cooperation, believing that supernatural threats were more effective than monetary payment for motivating medical professionals. You're not just treating diseases, you're navigating a minefield of curses, hexes, and magical coercion that could follow you for the rest of your life. Your colleague Dr. William ignored the threats of a desperate family last winter, refusing to treat their plague-stricken son without proper payment. Within a month, William's own children had died of mysterious illnesses, his wife had left him, and his practice had collapsed as word spread that he was cursed by the family he'd refused to help. Whether the curse was real or just coincidence, the result was the same. William's reputation was destroyed, and he eventually fled the city to escape the supernatural consequences of his medical business decisions. The most terrifying aspect of medieval medical economics was how supernatural threats created a parallel payment system that operated outside normal commercial relationships. Families who couldn't afford gold or silver would offer curses as collateral, promising that their supernatural vengeance would be more valuable than any monetary compensation if you failed to save their loved ones. Medieval physicians had to calculate not just the financial costs of providing free medical care, but also the spiritual risks of refusing treatment to patients who claimed magical powers of revenge. You examine the child's symptoms: high fever, labored breathing, and a rash that suggests scarlet fever or another serious infection that your medieval remedies can't effectively treat. The parents watch your every move, whispering prayers and threats in equal measure, making it clear that they hold you personally responsible for their daughter's fate regardless of your actual ability to cure diseases that won't be treatable for centuries. Medieval medicine placed impossible burdens on physicians, demanding miracle cures while threatening supernatural punishment for inevitable failures. The economic pressure of curse-based payment systems was particularly cruel because it exploited physicians' fears of supernatural retaliation while providing no actual compensation for medical services. You could spend hours treating patients who paid with threats rather than money, depleting your supplies and energy while accumulating a collection of curses that might or might not have real power but definitely had real psychological effects. Medieval medical practice required physicians to be simultaneously healers, economists, and spiritual warriors, fighting battles on multiple fronts while trying to maintain some semblance of financial stability. The peasant father begins describing the specific curses he'll invoke if his daughter dies. Your food will turn to ash in your mouth, your sleep will be haunted by demons, your medical instruments will turn against you, and your own children will suffer the same fate as his daughter. Medieval curse traditions were remarkably detailed and creative, with desperate families developing elaborate supernatural revenge fantasies that were designed to terrify physicians into providing free medical care regardless of their ability to pay. You decide to treat the child despite the inadequate payment, knowing that refusing would result in supernatural threats that could haunt you for years, while accepting means providing expensive medical care for essentially no compensation. This decision represents the impossible economics of medieval medicine, where physicians were expected to be both successful businessmen and charitable healers, balancing financial survival against spiritual safety in a world where both were constantly threatened. The child's fever begins to break after you administer herbal remedies and perform bloodletting, though whether this improvement results from your treatments or natural recovery, you'll never know for certain. The parent's threats transform into promises of blessings and protection, demonstrating how quickly supernatural payment systems could shift from curses to rewards based on medical outcomes. Medieval medicine operated in a world where your spiritual safety depended entirely on treatment results that were often beyond your control. Historians still argue whether medieval curse-based payment systems were genuine expressions of folk magic beliefs or simply psychological warfare designed to coerce physicians into providing free medical care. The evidence suggests that both physicians and patients took supernatural threats seriously, creating a parallel economy where curses and blessings functioned as alternative forms of medical compensation that could be more valuable than traditional currency. You pack your instruments while the parents shower you with blessings and promises of magical protection, knowing that your decision to treat their child despite inadequate payment has earned you supernatural allies who might prove more valuable than gold in a world where curses and hexes were considered as real and dangerous as physical diseases. Medieval medicine required physicians to be spiritual entrepreneurs as much as medical practitioners, building portfolios of supernatural relationships that could protect them from the magical threats that were an inevitable part of treating desperate patients who had nothing left to offer except their prayers and their curses. You knock on the heavy oak door of the manor house, knowing that this could be your final house call, not because you're planning to retire, but because medieval medicine has finally caught up with you in the most terrifying way possible. The message that summoned you here was written in a shaking hand, describing symptoms that sound suspiciously like the plague, and you realize that after years of dodging death through medical malpractice, angry mobs, poisoned supplies, and supernatural curses, you might finally meet your end through the simple act of trying to heal someone whose disease will kill you both. The irony of your situation would be amusing if it weren't so absolutely terrifying. You've survived bloodletting disasters that nearly drained patients to death, urine tasting sessions that exposed you to every disease known to medieval medicine, surgical procedures that were essentially legalized torture, and herbal remedies that were more poisonous than the ailments they were supposed to cure. You've escaped angry families seeking revenge for medical failures, avoided accusations of witchcraft for practicing anatomy, outmaneuvered barber surgeons trying to destroy your reputation, and navigated the deadly politics of treating royal patients who could order your execution on a whim. The door opens to reveal a scene that confirms your worst fears. The household is in chaos, with servants fleeing and family members barricaded in distant rooms, leaving only a desperate butler to guide you to your patient. The familiar smell of death and decay fills the air, mixed with the acrid smoke of burning herbs that people believe will ward off pestilence. You've walked into the final examination of your medical career, where your patient's disease is almost certainly more dangerous than any treatment you could possibly provide. Your plague doctor costume feels heavier than usual as you climb the stairs, each step bringing you closer to a confrontation with the ultimate enemy of medieval medicine, a disease that kills physicians faster than they can kill patients, which is saying something considering the mortality rates of medieval medical practice. The leather-beaked mask that's supposed to protect you from bad air feels like a funeral shroud, and the aromatic herbs stuffed inside it smell more like funeral flowers than protective medicine. The patient lies in a bed that looks more like a deathbed, covered in the telltale black boils that mark advanced plague infection. Her breathing is labored. Her skin has taken on the grayish pallor that indicates approaching death, and the sweet stench of decay suggests that she's already begun the process of dying that you're supposed to somehow reverse with medieval medical techniques that are completely useless against bacterial infections. This is the moment when all your years of medical training, all your accumulated knowledge of bloodletting and herbal remedies and astrological timing, prove to be absolutely worthless against a disease that doesn't care about your education or your good intentions. You begin your examination knowing that every breath you take in this room increases your chances of joining your patient in the grave within days. Medieval physicians treating plague victims were essentially committing suicide in slow motion, exposing themselves to deadly disease while providing treatments that had no chance of success. The most honest thing you could do would be to leave immediately and let the patient die naturally. But your professional oath and the family's desperate pleas make abandonment impossible despite the obvious futility of medical intervention. The woman's pulse is weak and irregular. Her fever burns through your gloves when you touch her skin, and the black boils covering her body seem to pulse with malevolent life. You prescribe the standard plague treatments: bloodletting to balance the humors, herbal poultices to draw out the poison, and prayers to saints who seem to have abandoned the medical profession entirely. These remedies are completely useless against bacterial infections, but they're all medieval medicine has to offer in the face of diseases that won't be understood or treatable for centuries. As you pack your instruments, you realize that this house call represents everything that's wrong with medieval medicine: physicians risking their lives to provide treatments that don't work for diseases they don't understand, while families pay fortunes for hope that's based on ignorance rather than knowledge. You've spent your career walking the razor's edge between healing and harming, between helping and killing, between salvation and damnation, and now you face the possibility that your final patient will be the one who finally drags you down into the grave you've been avoiding throughout your entire medical career. The walk home feels different this time, heavier somehow, as if you're carrying the weight of all the medical failures, all the patients you couldn't save, all the families you disappointed, and all the colleagues who died trying to practice medicine in an age when healing was more dangerous than the diseases themselves. You wonder if this is how all medieval physicians end, not in glory or retirement, but in the simple recognition that they've finally encountered the patient whose disease will prove stronger than their will to survive. Your house feels like a sanctuary as you remove the plague doctor costume and wash your hands with the strongest soap available, knowing that these precautions are probably useless but needing to maintain the illusion that you can somehow protect yourself from the consequences of your profession. Medieval medicine has taught you that death is always just one patient away, one house call away, one treatment away from claiming the physician along with the patient. You sit by your window, watching the sun set over a city where disease and death are constant companions, where physicians are both healers and potential victims, where every medical success is balanced by multiple failures, and where the practice of medicine is essentially a long, slow dance with death that eventually claims everyone who dares to call themselves a healer. The most successful medieval physicians weren't necessarily the most skilled. They were simply the luckiest, the ones who managed to avoid the final house call that would transform them from healers into patients, from physicians into corpses, from the living into cautionary tales whispered in medical schools about the occupational hazards of trying to heal people in an age when medicine was more dangerous than the diseases it claimed to cure. Tomorrow there will be another house call, another patient, another opportunity for medieval medicine to claim another victim, and you're no longer certain whether that victim will be the patient you're treating or the physician providing the treatment. In medieval times, the line between healer and victim was thinner than the blade of a surgeon's knife, and just as sharp, and just as likely to draw blood from the person holding it as from the person it was meant to help. The candle burns lower as darkness settles over the city, and you prepare for what might be your final night as a living physician rather than another casualty of medieval medicine's war against diseases it couldn't understand, treatments it couldn't perfect, and expectations it couldn't possibly meet. Sweet dreams, if you can manage them, knowing that tomorrow's house call might be your last. The gentle rhythm of your breathing slows as exhaustion finally overtakes the adrenaline of another day survived in the most dangerous profession of medieval times. Your medical bag sits by the door, packed and ready for tomorrow's challenges, its instruments gleaming softly in the candlelight like old friends who have shared countless battles against disease and death. The leather is worn smooth from years of house calls, the metal tools polished by constant use, and the vials of medicines arranged with the precision of someone who knows that organization might mean the difference between life and death, though in medieval medicine, that difference was often smaller than anyone cared to admit. Outside your window, the city sleeps fitfully, its citizens dreaming of health and healing while remaining blissfully unaware of how dangerous their physicians' jobs really were, how many medical professionals died in service of patients they couldn't save, and how the practice of medicine in medieval times was essentially a form of elaborate, expensive, and often fatal guesswork performed by people who cared more about helping others than preserving their own lives. The irony of medieval medicine was that the physicians who survived longest were often those who cared least about their patients' welfare, while the most dedicated healers frequently died young, victims of their own compassion and professional commitment. Your eyelids grow heavy as you finally allow yourself to rest, knowing that sleep is the only escape from a profession that demanded everything while promising nothing except the opportunity to risk your life again tomorrow in service of people who might curse you, threaten you, poison you, or simply die despite your best efforts, leaving you to face the consequences of medical failures that were often inevitable given the primitive state of medieval medical knowledge and the impossible expectations placed on physicians who were expected to work miracles with tools that belonged more in torture chambers than healing rooms. The last thing you see before sleep claims you is the gentle flicker of candlelight dancing across your medical instruments, those faithful companions that have helped you navigate the treacherous waters of medieval medicine, and you whisper a quiet prayer of gratitude for surviving another day in the most dangerous profession of your time, while acknowledging that tomorrow might finally be the day when your luck runs out, and you join the countless other physicians who died trying to heal a world that was often more dangerous for the healers than for the patients they served.